it's really a privilege to be up here this afternoon. I want to first thank Meredith. I'm going to get emotional about this. Meredith has spent so much time crafting the introductions for each and every fellow before their presentations, and I think it is just but one expression of her incredible kindness, generosity, and also brilliance. And I want to thank the Joy Foundation as well for supporting my fellowship this year. And I want to thank my two research partners. I know one's definitely in the audience, Diana Myers, and also Catherine Lempres as well, for your just incredible, intelligent engagement with my research. And I also want to thank my fellow fellows, and I see you all out in the audience. My conversations with you, but also more, I feel like just learning from you has opened up so many new exciting vistas of inquiry for me and challenged me in so many numerous ways. I also want to give a special shout out to my family, and they're all over here, so they have traveled incredible distances to be here with me this afternoon to support me, and I'm just so grateful for their presence this afternoon. And last but certainly not least, I want to thank my partner, Eric, and just for all of the incredible ways that he supports me. In my talk this afternoon, I'll talk about how manuscripts are the sine qua non of my research, and Eric is the sine qua non of my life, and so I'm thankful for him. All right, enough of that. All right. Just over a month ago, the seemingly impossible happened. News about a medieval nun went viral. On Wednesday, January 9th, the journal Science Advances published online an article in which the investigators claimed that they had found tiny bits of blue pigment embedded within the dental calculus, or the calcified tooth tartar of a 40 to 60-year-old nun who lived sometime between 997 and 1162 CE at a monastic complex at Dalheim, Germany. Microscopic analyses of the tartar reveal that the blue pigment was lapis lazuli-derived ultramarine. It was by far the most expensive form of blue pigment used in medieval works of art because it was mined from a single region in Afghanistan and thus a luxury trade good. Within the context of medieval book production, ultramarine, like gold and silver leaf, was reserved for deluxe codices, and only highly trained artists were entrusted with its care. Anita Rodini, an archaeologist at the University of York in England and the study's principal investigator, was initially dumbfounded by the discovery. She consulted archaeologists, anthropologists, biologists, and historians with relevant expertise to assess the significance of her findings. They determined that the most likely explanation for the presence of the ultramarine pigment in the nun's teeth was either that she was an illuminator in her community's scriptorium who used to lick her brush to make a fine point, or that she was responsible for preparing the pigments for her own use and or the use of other illuminators in her community. If true, these conclusions present another significant challenge to the long-held assumption that monks, rather than nuns, were the primary producers of books throughout the Middle Ages. Moreover, the research methods employed in the study offer a new approach to recovering the histories of medieval nuns in their lived totalities. As the investigators note, identifying the early contributions of religious women to medieval book production, especially before the 12th century, is challenging due to the limited number of surviving books, the precarious documentation of women's communities, and the tendency of scribes to leave their works unsigned. Among books in women's monastic libraries, fewer than 15% bear the names of women or titles, and before the 12th century, fewer than 1% of books can be attributed to women. As a result, individual female scribes remain poorly visible in the historical record, and it is likely that most of their scribal work has gone unrecognized. Thanks to the efforts of these investigators, the artistic and literary contributions of medieval nuns are now receiving the public attention they so richly deserve. On the very day when Science Advances published the investigators' article, it was picked up by major news outlets from CNN to the New York Times to NPR to The Atlantic. And within 24 hours of the news breaking, I received excited emails from my fellow Radcliffe Fellows and also staff at the Institute with links to these articles. Of course, I was delighted to see that this discovery was generating so much interest. But I must confess that like many medievalists who were following the story, including some of the investigators behind the study, I was also frustrated by some of the headlines, particularly by those that proclaimed that this finding had the potential to rewrite the history of medieval nuns, or that it was shedding light on some long-forgotten history of these women. Such proclamations outright conceal or ignore the important research that has been undertaken over the past 30 years to find evidence of nuns working as artists and scribes. Notable examples of such efforts include the monographs by Harvard's own Geoffrey Hamburger in 1997 and by Alison Beach in 2004. For many medievalists, then, the discovery of a medieval nun with ultramarine pigment embedded in the tartar of her teeth was not surprising. It presents new archaeological methods for providing further proof of what is already known about medieval nuns. These methods will undoubtedly become indispensable additions to the toolkit that scholars have already been using to identify nuns' artistic and scribal productions. The burden of proving that nuns possess the requisite literacies and skills to undertake such productions on their own is still much, much higher than it is for monks. And the existence of the remains of a nun with ultramarine in her teeth appears to many to provide the very concrete, credible, nay, irrefutable proof needed to satisfy this inequitable obligation. Old assumptions about these women as uneducated or illiterate or unskilled die hard, even among scholars who should know better, but don't. Perhaps because of some sexist preoccupation about the past and possibly the present too. Recovering evidence that nuns worked as scribes and artists has always been an essential facet of my research on the liturgical practices of their communities. In my forthcoming book, which Meredith so graciously introduced, The Care of Nuns, The Ministries of Benedictine Women in England During the Central Middle Ages, I reconstruct the liturgical roles that Benedictine women performed from roughly 900 to 1200 through close paleographical, codicological, and textual analyses of their extant books. And in my current project, Liturgy Matters, Benedictine Women's Communities in Medieval England, I expand upon the research from my first book to examine more comprehensively the materiality of Benedictine nuns' liturgical practices. This turn to materiality was inspired by recent theorists of religion who have sought to understand how and why humans choose, transport, repurpose, and consume objects for sacred ends. They argue that religionists are not so much believers as technologists who transform and are transformed by select objects through sensual engagement. Humans do not solely possess the powers to speak, remind, surprise, enchant, disgust, heal, and harm. Objects do too, and scholars and practitioners of religion must reckon with their powers. In my current book project, I take up this charge by reviewing medieval nuns as technologists through the objects they created, acquired, and treasured for liturgical use. Most of these objects no longer survive due to their natural ephemerality, their inevitable obsolescence through frequent use and ritual innovation, or their destruction, appropriation, or migration during and after Henry VIII's dissolution of all religious houses in England, Wales, and Ireland between 1536 and 1540. Still, nuns' liturgical books supply important clues for reconstructing, even if only partially, the features and uses of these objects. Nuns' liturgical books, then, are the sine qua non of my research, and not just because of the limitations posed by the surviving material evidence, but more importantly because these books served as the primary matter of nuns' liturgies. Without them, nuns could not have performed their daily liturgical practices. It would have been impossible for them to remember all of the prayers, readings, chants, and actions that were proper to the masses, 8 hours of sung prayer that constituted the divine office, and the other rituals that they enacted every single day. On account of the indispensability of books to nuns' individual and corporate realization of their vocations as vowed religious, precious materials and extensive labor were often dedicated to books' production, and they were then stored and used with great care to ensure their integrity and durability. Some books, depending on the circumstances surrounding their making and handling, were even venerated as relics, prominently displayed on the altars of nuns' churches or buried with cherished members of the community. All of the extant liturgical books from communities of Benedictine nuns in medieval England bear telling signs of their production, circulation, and application, from marginalia to drops of wax. Each book is a veritable archaeological site awaiting excavation. The evidence unearthed must be meticulously studied and, as much as possible, pieced together like the tesserae of a scattered mosaic, to try to reconstruct how nuns fulfilled their obligations to worship God, to honor the saints, and to pray for themselves, their fellow sisters, and to those who were entrusted to their care. Such reconstructions will invariably be riddled with incongruities and uncertainties and lacunae. This would be the case even if all the books ever owned by Benedictine nuns in medieval England still survived for analysis, because they present scripts intended for recitation in, not verbatim records of, performance. And yet, given the current state of the evidence from their communities, these scripts offer the closest witnesses that we have to their liturgical practices, and thus are privileged in my history of those practices. For the remainder of my talk this afternoon, I want to acquaint you with 3 manuscripts that continually prove to be rich sites of evidence for my research, but have received surprisingly little attention from other scholars. All of these manuscripts were owned by communities of Benedictine nuns in medieval England, and, as I will demonstrate, they all feature the handiwork of female scribes in their initial production and/or subsequent adaptation, even though they variously date to the 11th and 12th centuries, the very upper limit of the temporal span that scholars have determined to be the most difficult for identifying nuns working as scribes. Thus, in focusing my remarks today on these manuscripts, I seek to highlight my own contributions to the growing body of evidence advancing medieval nuns' literacies, particularly their ability to work as copyists, correctors, and even composers of texts. To this end, I will not proceed chronologically, but from my most secure attribution to more probable ones. Spoiler alert, I have not exhumed the bodies of any nuns with ink-stained teeth, but I'm hoping that my findings will encourage archaeologists to go out digging. The first manuscript, now held at the Bodleian Library at the University of Oxford under the shelf mark Bodley 451, is a book that was produced in the early 12th century at Nunaminster, or St. Mary's Abbey in Winchester for collation, that is, the evening gathering of the entire monastic community in the cloister after Vespers and before Compline, at which the abbess or prioress read aloud selections from the scriptures, commentaries or homilies on the scriptural lections of the day, saints' lives, commentaries on the Benedictine rule, or an edifying word of her own devising. Nunnaminster had been founded in around 900 near the seat of West Saxon royal power in Winchester at the initiative of Queen Aelswith, the widow of King Alfred, but its construction was completed by her son, Edward the Elder, in the early years of his reign. One of Edward's daughters, Edburga, was given to the community as a child oblate at the age of 3, and upon her death was buried there and venerated as a saint. Throughout its history, which endured until its dissolution in 1539 by Henry VIII, Nunnaminster enjoyed generous benefactions of lands and movable wealth from royalty and high-ranking nobility. Beginning under the reign of William I after the Norman conquest of England in 1066, the Abbess of Nunnaminster ranked as baron ex officio, bearing the responsibilities of raising levies in times of war and providing knight service to the king. Extant narrative sources attest to the presence of a school at the Abbey, which educated its members and other women in its care to attain high levels of literacy in both reading and writing. Bodley 451 provides clear evidence to support the claims of these sources. Bodley 451 contains Smaragdus of San Miel's Crown of Monks, selections from Isidore of Seville's 3 books of sentences, a miscellany of 17 sermons, mostly by Caesarius of Arles, but also by Augustine, Pseudo-Augustine, Maximus of Turin, and Peter Chrysologus, and an account of a miracle performed by Edburga, the daughter of Edward the Elder that I mentioned before. Nearly the entirety of the book was copied by a single scribe, who wrote an illegible Anglo-Caroline minuscule and left generous space between each line. The size and layout of the page, coupled with the legibility of the text, made this book well suited to public instruction. The addition of accent marks and supplemental punctuation by a later scribe would have enhanced the text's legibility. These additions occur primarily in the 17 sermons included in the book. Most of the sermons are longer in length than the chapters of either Smaragdus's Crown of Monks or Isidore's sentences, and some lectors may have required additional performance cues for the modulation of their voice to help make the readings more intelligible to their audience. So interrogative sentences that originally ended in a punctus, or a point indicating a pause, were changed to punctus interrogativi, or question marks, again, to help the reader know when to elevate her voice. But also, we see the addition of punctus versus, which look like semicolons, which help to set off a quotation from scripture, or when the speaker is supposed to assume a voice for a rhetorical effect. Gibbet paragraph marks were also inserted into a few texts, probably to break the sermon into smaller sense units, or to designate passages of particular import to the community. The paragraph marks added on folio 98 verso to one of Caesarius of Arles' sermons on the preservation of chastity in marriage suggest the latter interpretation, because they set off a passage affirming the equality that women share with men in the life of faith. What is worse is that these things, that is, acts of fornication before marriage, are committed by many men without any fear of the Lord, since they are dismissed by many in custom, and thus are said to be cheap and trivial, so that now they are not thought to be serious crimes. But in the Catholic faith, whatever is not entirely permitted to women is not permitted to men. For both men and women, too, are redeemed with one price, that is, with the precious blood of Christ. In one faith they are called, and in one body of the church they are gathered. Caesarius' admonition that the demands and rewards of the life of faith were the same for both sexes offered a salutary message to women, irrespective of their vocation in the church. The nuns at Nunaminster may have welcomed this message, not only for themselves, but also for the other laity that were in their pastoral care. The lectors of Bodley 451 would have been aided in the location of specific texts within the volume by consulting the 3 tables of contents included before each of the 3 main collections of texts. On the slide is the first table of contents listing the chapters in Smaragdus' Crown of Monks. Page markers in the forms of loops of thread sewn into the margins of the book may have also helped to aid in the quick location of certain texts. One such page marker in purple thread can still be found in the bottom margin on folio 34 verso, where chapter 42 of Smaragdus' Crown on the zeal of pastoral office begins. This page marker occurs at a relative halfway point in the 100 chapters of the Crown, but its addition may also reflect the pastoral concerns or devotional interests of Nunaminster's abbess or prioress. We can deduce that Bodley 451 was likely used for the instruction of the community at evening collation on the basis of its contents. 12th century lists of collation readings from monastic houses often included Isidore's sentences, and in the prologue to his Crown of Monks, Smaragdus explicitly stated that the text was to serve as a companion to the Benedictine rule, recommending that a chapter from it be read daily at collation to supplement the reading from the rule at morning chapter. The presence of drops of wax and wax stains on several of Bodley 451's folios suggests that Smaragdus' recommendation for his text was followed at Nunaminster. And so what seems clear is that these drops of wax indicate that the lector brought the book too close to a candle, and that drops of wax were then spilled on the page. And this is likely because the lector was reading in a dimly lit space or at evening. Quite remarkably, the main scribe of Bodley 451 included a colophon on folio 119 verso, immediately following the final sermon. Such scribal colophons are very uncommon before the 15th century, but in this one, the scribe identified herself as a scriptrix, beseeching her readers, "Save the scribe, and may she remain unharmed forever." This plea offers the most unequivocal evidence that we have that at least one nun at Nunaminster was working as a scribe in the early 12th century. But there is another hand who made marginal additions to several folios around the same time as the main scribe. These additions primarily consist of alphabet trials and various inscriptions, prayer verses, and lines from sermons on the folios where they were copied. The appearance and content of these additions suggest that they were made by an inexperienced hand, perhaps a student in the Abbey's school. I must admit that I am particularly charmed by the repetition of the verse from Virgil's Eclogues, "Amor vincit omnia," love conquers all, once in conjunction with the opening line from the Hail Mary, Ave Maria. When I first saw this coincidence, I couldn't help but think of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and the description of the prioress in the general prologue. About her arm she bore of small coral a set of beads, adorned with large green beads, and thereon hung a brooch of very bright gold, on which there was written an A with a crown, and after, Amor vincit omnia. Evidently, the nuns of early 12th century Nunaminster weren't all that different from those satirized by Chaucer in the late 14th century. And for those of you who haven't had the opportunity of looking at this gorgeous manuscript copy of the Canterbury Tales known as the Ellesmere Chaucer, which includes figures of the different pilgrims on their way to Canterbury, I just have to note that the one illuminator responsible for the prioress's portrait did include the beads on her wrist, which is just so wonderful. So the second manuscript I wish to discuss this afternoon is an 11th century gospel book from Barking Abbey, now held at the Bodleian Library under the shelf mark Bodley 155. The remains of this community are located just over 10 miles east of central London. Barking was the only community of Benedictine nuns in England that claimed a continuous history from its initial foundation by Ethelberga and her brother Erkenwald in around 670 through to its surrender to Henry VIII's commissioner on November the 14th, 1539. And though the Abbey's church, cloister, and surrounding buildings were nearly completely dismantled in the decades following its dissolution, textual sources, archaeological excavations, and GIS mapping have helped scholars to reconstruct the orientation, dimensions, and features of the monastic precinct. Throughout its history, Barking attracted the daughters of royalty, nobility, and other luminaries as members. In 1381, Elizabeth Chaucer, probably a daughter of Geoffrey Chaucer, made her religious profession at the Abbey. Barking was located just a mile away from St. Leonard's Priory in Stratford, the community led by Chaucer's prioress in his Canterbury Tales. Since the reign of William I, Barking's abbess, like Nunnaminsters, ranked as baron ex officio. And at its dissolution in 1539, Barking was the third wealthiest community of religious women in England. Bodley 155 is the only complete gospel book to survive from an abbey or priory of Benedictine nuns in medieval England. It presents a unique source of evidence for examining nuns' scribal and liturgical practices, because through various types of correction and addition, it was thoroughly adapted for public recitation. These alterations have not received scholarly attention, yet when systematically studied, they offer rich insight into the history of the manuscript's production and use at Barking. The many interlinear and marginal corrections and additions made to the book supply missing narrative details, alternative readings for ambiguous pronouns and phrases, pronunciation guides, supplemental punctuation, neumes, and other vocal cues like passion letters. They all indicate that it was produced and adapted not for private devotional reading, but for communal liturgical proclamation. The scribes responsible for its making attended to the demands of performance on both lectors and auditors by fashioning a text that could announce the good news solemnly and clearly. The wax stains on many of the book's folios suggest that it was used for the gospel reading at the evening office of matins on Sundays and feast days by the Abbess of Barking in accordance with the dictates of the Benedictine rule. Due to dim lighting, she probably brought the book too close to a candle, which then spilled wax on the page. Compared with earlier and contemporary Anglo-Saxon gospel books, with respect to both size and layout, Bodley 155 is a typical witness to the types of books that were used for liturgical reading. It contains the texts of all four Gospels, preceded by their chapter lists and prefaces, except for Matthew's, and that's because the manuscript was mutilated at the beginning. At the book's end, there is a capitulary detailing the gospel lections to be read on different days of the week and feast days throughout the entire year. The bulk of Bodley 155 was copied by a single scribe, writing in the early 11th century in Anglo-Saxon minuscule, but there were at least 7 other scribes who worked on the production and alteration of Bodley 155 in the 11th and early 12th centuries. The vast majority of the alterations were made by the main scribe and a second scribe, who was writing in Anglo-Caroline minuscule not too long afterwards. I have categorized their alterations according to 3 types: identification of characters, clarification of plot, and guides to pronunciation. An example of the first type of alteration can be found on folio 37 recto. In the interlinear space above the verse from the Gospel of Matthew, "Then the Pharisees, departing, formed a plan to ensnare him in speech," the main scribe inserted, "When you read, say Jesus." That is, instead of saying the pronoun eum or him, say Jesum or Jesus. This substitution would have rendered the gospel lection more intelligible to an auditor who may not have known who the him the Pharisees wished to ensnare in speech was. The insertion of Jesus provided the necessary identification of the central character in the scene. Another kind of scribal alteration found in Bodley 155 can be loosely grouped under the rubric of plot clarifications. These alterations were made either interlinearly or marginally to certain verses to provide more detail to the gospel lections for an auditor's benefit, mainly to give greater definition to a particular action or object in a given scene. A clear example of this type of alteration is found on folio 34 verso. The second scribe expuncted the verb mansit, he remained, from the Matthean verse, and leaving them, he went out of the city into Bethany and remained there, and interlinearly supplied a new reading that provides greater specificity to Jesus' actions. He was teaching them about the kingdom of God. Different, though no less helpful in the oral performance of the gospel reading, are the addition of pronunciation guides, supplemental punctuation, numation, and passion letters. A fairly thoroughgoing repunctuation of Bodley 155 was undertaken by 3 of the scribes, mostly by the main scribe and second scribe. As you can see on the slide, through both addition and erasure, the punctuation was altered, likely to help a lector to know when to pause or to provide certain vocal effects to a reading. And so here we're actually in the Gospel of Luke, and this is actually the parable of the prodigal son. And you can see that the punctus interrogativus, the question mark that was originally here, the top part was erased and then added down here. So when the prodigal son is thinking to himself, my son, like how many servants does my father have that are, receiving bread and more well-fed than I am, and I am famished? Move the punctuation down here to actually include that whole quotation from the son that's thinking about that question. The clearest evidence of Bodley 155's intended use in the musical declamation of the gospel is the addition of adiastomatic neumes. That is, neumes that were not written on staff lines and therefore communicate little pitch information. As you can see in the example on the slide, such additions would have helped the reader to align the melodic inflections to the syllables of the text as she intoned it. Further indications of how the Gospels were to be proclaimed were provided through the additions of passion letters to the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John. As you can see on the slide, which features the opening of the Gospel of Matthew's Passion, the main scribe inserted the letters T and C in the interlinear space. The meanings of these letters were multiple, depending on time and place, and changed over the course of the Middle Ages. But during the period when Bodley 155 was copied and adapted, T often marked Jesus' words and stood for tenete, hold, or tarde, slowly, indicating that they should be chanted with a lower voice and at a slower speed than the other speaking parts. C marked the words of the evangelists, Jesus' followers, Pilate, and the Jews, and stood for chito, quickly, or chitius, more quickly, indicating that they should be chanted with a higher voice and at a faster speed. Thus, these passion letters signified how the lector was to intone the different speaking parts. The foregoing discussion has shown that the scribal interventions in Bodley 155 transformed the Gospels into a script fit for liturgical performance. What I have yet to establish is whether the scribes who made the various alterations were nuns at Barking. The most suggestive evidence in support of an affirmative answer to this question is the addition made by the second scribe on folio 167 recto to the Johannine passage recalling the raising of Lazarus. Next to the verse describing the Jews who visited Lazarus' sister Mary to hear and see for themselves the miracle Jesus had worked, the second scribe included the seemingly absent Martha in the scene by supplying et Martham and Martha in the outer margin. At first glance, such an addition may seem unsurprising, given that Martha is repeatedly mentioned in the preceding verses. but she rarely makes such an appearance in extant Bibles, gospel books, and lectionaries produced earlier than or contemporary with Bodley 155. The rarity of this reading thus begs the question, whence the inspiration for the second scribe's edition? As Giles Constable has shown, Martha and Mary served as potent figures of both the active and contemplative lives for lay and religious of both sexes in the patristic and medieval theological, liturgical, and artistic traditions. Yet, in medieval England, barking was specially devoted to Martha. Among extant liturgical books from Benedictine communities, Martha's liturgical veneration was noted in only one, the calendar opening Barking's early 15th century ordinal, which lists her commemoration on July 29th. The addition of Martha to the account of her brother's raising then seems to inscribe the liturgical practices of a particular community and the devotional interests of a scribe fully embedded within that community. It may just reveal the hand of a nun trained in and formed by Barking's habitus of prayer. But we also know of a Barking nun who was operative as a scribe during the very time that Bodley 155 was produced. In his lives of Barking's abbesses, Ethelberga and Wulfhild, Gosselin of Saint-Bertin, the renowned peripatetic Flemish hagiographer of English saints, writing in the second half of the 11th century, repeatedly mentioned a woman named Wulfruna Judith, who was a member of the community during Wulfhild's abbacy in the late 10th century, but lived well into the second half of the 11th. Wulfruna Judith not only served as the Abbey sacristan, helping to organize the community's liturgies, but also as a scribe. So memorable were her deeds as a scriptrix that Gosselin deemed it fitting to remember her as such. In his Life of Ethelberga, Gosselin recalled the story of the infamous theft and miraculous recovery of a missal that Wulfruna Judith had copied. For those who don't know, a missal is a type of liturgical book that contains all of the texts needed to celebrate the Masses throughout the entire year. The Barking community treasured Wulfruna Judith's missal, prominently displaying it on the altar dedicated to its founder, Ethelberga, because it was the Abbey's Optimus Codex, or best book, according to Gosselin, who must have seen and handled the book himself during his time at Barking. There is no explicit evidence in Bodley 155 that would allow us to identify Wulfruna Judith as one of the scribes behind the book's production and adaptation for liturgical use. However, as a scribe active in copying liturgical books at Barking, and as an officer instrumental to the community's liturgies, she certainly would have been capable of performing such tasks. The third and final manuscript that I wish to acquaint you with this afternoon, albeit a bit more briefly than the preceding two, is a 12th century psalter once owned by Warewell Abbey, but now preserved in special collections in the library of St. John's College at the University of Cambridge. Its manuscript C18. Warewell was located in the county of Hampshire, about 10 miles northwest of Nunnamünster. The abbey was founded in around the year 1000 by Queen Elfrith, the third wife of King Edgar. A charter later issued by her son, King Ethelred II, credits her with possessing and diligently building up the abbey while she was alive. An unnamed daughter of Ethelred's was the abbess of the house in the mid-11th century. In 1051, her brother, King Edward the Confessor, had his wife Edith imprisoned at the abbey. In 1141, Warewell's fortunes were nearly completely devastated when, at the height of the civil war between King Stephen and Empress Matilda, the former's troops set fire to the church where the community had sought refuge. It would take nearly 50 years for the abbey to recover fully from this event. Instrumental to the reversal in Warewell's fortunes were the efforts of Matilda de Bailleul, a young widow and daughter of a Flemish lord who ruled as abbess of the community from around 1174 to 1212. None of the abbey's buildings still stand today. They were destroyed after Henry VIII's dissolution of the community in 1539. One of the few artifacts to survive from Abbess Matilda's tenure in office is this psalter, which includes an opening prayer for an abbess to use to consecrate the offering of the Psalms, a calendar, the first 14 verses of the Gospel of John, the psalter proper, beginning imperfectly, the biblical canticles, creeds, and Our Father, a litany with petitions, 50 prayers, including 4 to the Trinity, a little office of the Virgin, and an office of the dead. At least 19 different scribes were operative in the making of this psalter, beginning with the 2 who copied the calendar, psalms, and prayers in a Romanesque script sometime in the late 1160s or early 1170s. Once the psalter was in Abbess Matilda's possession, most likely when she became Abbess of Wherwell in around 1174, another scribe, also writing in Romanesque script, added this prayer of confession for an abbess on 2 bifolia that were inserted into the antepenultimate choir. This same scribe also altered some of the grammatical forms in the preceding prayer so that it scripted a woman instead of a man as its supplicant. And actually you can see the changes made here. So these 2 adjectives originally ended in masculine endings, and they were changed to feminine endings. And actually, so forceful was the corrector to the text that there's actually a little hole that you can detect right behind the A here. In the early 13th century, a different scribe added to the opening flyleaf a prayer for an abbess to say prior to reciting all 150 psalms as an intercessory offering. And on 2 bifolia appended to the book, this scribe copied an Office of the Dead, a ritual of remembrance that supplemented the hours of sung prayer at Vespers, Matins, and Lauds. And on May 11th of the calendar, which actually is my birthday too, it's another thing, this scribe recorded the obituary of Matilda's maternal uncle, Osto de Saint-Omer, who was also of Flemish descent, but had traveled around much of Western Europe and the Levant as a member, then provincial master, and finally a worthy of the Knights Templar until his death in around 1174. In a forthcoming article in Speculum, I make the case for Osto's patronage and ownership of the Psalter before it was given to Matilda. The 15 other scribes who made additions to the Psalter at various times throughout the 13th century entered in the calendar additional saints' feast days and obituaries of relatives, community members, and vowed religious and clerics in Wherwell's spiritual network. As you can see on the slide, the death anniversary of Abbess Matilda was added on December 13th, sometime after her death in 1212. There isn't conclusive evidence within the Psalter itself to prove that some of the nuns of Wherwell were responsible for making the various alterations to the book after it came into Abbess Matilda's possession. However, there is additional evidence from the Abbey that indicates that the nuns there were capable of creating original literary compositions. On the final folio of a liturgical calendar that was owned by Wherwell by the late 12th century, 11 elegiac couplets commemorating the death of Abbess Matilda were copied. These couplets offer an important witness to the literary skills of the community's members in the early 13th century, because these verses were most likely copied by one of Matilda's fellow sisters, perhaps by her niece and successor, Euphemia de Waller. The 6th through 9th couplets read, Matilda, by disposition a mother, by merits a matron. Although not a virgin by flesh, she was a virago. Married to a man without the offspring of men, she sent him ahead. And laboring for Christ, she became a parent in duty. A jewel of her people and a woman in sex only. In habits and merits, she was completely manly. Flanders truly gave her birth, England rule, Wherwell an end, one faithful to see God. If the nuns of Wherwell could craft compositions like this Latin poem, then they would have possessed the level of literacy necessary to make the various alterations to the Psalter. To conclude, Liturgy mattered to communities of Benedictine nuns. Literacy did too, that was what I was wanting to say, throughout the Middle Ages. For the vast majority of every day, their time was spent engaged in praying the 8 hours of the divine office, celebrating masses, and performing the rituals proper to a given feast, day of the week, or change in the community, such as the profession of a new member, the death of an established one, or the elevation in office or sanctity of a treasured one. Keeping time in this way, heeding the steady rhythm of the days, months, seasons, and years of the liturgical calendar, formed the identities of the nuns who observed it, both as individuals and as a collective. Essential to the process of formation in a particular community were the prayers and readings they recited, the chants they intoned, the other sounds they made and heard, the spaces they moved through and into and animated, and the objects they saw, wore, handled, consumed, venerated, transformed, and were in turn transformed by. Scholars interested in studying Benedictine nuns must first to endeavor to recompose the communal ritual practices to which these women daily committed themselves. And they must do so through the very books they produced and used, because these objects were the primary matter of their liturgies. Thank you very much.